A man lost a bet with his friends and had to invite a homeless woman to dinner. When the woman told him about her life and the struggles she had endured, the man began to cry. Night fell over the city, draping its cloak of lights and shadows across the skyscrapers that cut through the horizon like steel blades. Daniel Johnson, standing before the mirror in his office, adjusted the cuffs of his custom-made suit, a reflection of his success and the calculated life he had built with dedication and coldness. His eyes, dark and devoid of emotion, gazed at the view without truly seeing it. To many, his name signified power and fortune. To him, it was a shield that kept him distant from the real world, where emotions were a weakness. That night, like so many others, he headed to the private club where he met with his circle of friends and acquaintances. Upon arrival, the dark wooden doors swung open, welcoming him into a space filled with cigar smoke and muffled laughter. Crystal chandeliers hung like jewels, illuminating mahogany tables occupied by men and women holding glasses, talking about investments, conquests, and trivial anecdotes. Among them, Mark and Olivia stood out as key figures in Daniel's routine. Mark, the lawyer with a sharp smile and shrewd gaze, was the first to notice Daniel's arrival. He stood with the elegance of a predator and greeted him with a friendly slap on the shoulder. "Daniel, just in time. We were discussing who has the worst luck at the poker table. Care to join us?" Daniel responded with a half smile, an expression he wore more out of habit than genuine amusement. He took a seat, and the cards began to move with the agility of expert hands. The evening fell into a familiar cycle of forced laughter, rising bets, and trivial comments. The club was his stage, and he, the protagonist in a play where nothing ever happened unexpectedly. Until Mark, with a mischievous gleam in his eyes, proposed something. "How about something different tonight? Something that adds a little spice to the game," he said, shuffling the cards with the precision of a seasoned gambler. "The loser must invite a homeless person to dinner at the city's fanciest restaurant." Laughter erupted around the table, a mix of disbelief and amusement. Daniel raised an eyebrow, considering the proposal. It was unusual for Mark to suggest something without a hidden agenda, but the idea of bringing someone as a contrast to the temple of opulence seemed for a moment like an interesting challenge. After all, his certainty of victory was unshakable. "I accept," Daniel replied, leaning forward with a gleam of challenge in his eyes. "But get ready, Mark, because you'll be the one to fulfill the bet." The game continued, the cards changing hands in a back-and-forth rhythm that filled the air with the sound of chips and nervous laughter. However, when the final round arrived, a heavy silence descended upon the table. Mark lifted his card and showed it with a triumphant smile. Daniel, in a slow, almost mechanical move, turned his card to reveal the symbol marking his defeat. The table erupted in laughter and mocking comments. Mark leaned toward him, his eyes full of satisfaction bordering on ridicule. "Oh, Daniel, looks like tonight wasn't your night. I hope you have good taste in choosing your guest." Daniel forced a dry smile, more to protect his pride than out of real amusement. The clock struck 9 when he stood up from the table, ignoring the pats on the back and the comments that followed him. The street was cold and damp, and the night air had a sharpness that seeped under the skin. Daniel walked, his perfectly fitted coat hugging his frame, along the sidewalks lit by neon lights and luxury store windows. He had kept harder promises, but none seemed as absurd as the one from that night. His gaze slipped over the shadows moving in the corners, figures huddled beneath tattered blankets and lost stares. Then he saw her. Caroline, a young woman with disheveled hair and an intense gaze, played a violin that had seen better days. Her fingers moved with precision and passion, filling the air with a melody that seemed out of place in that forgotten street. The music, full of notes of nostalgia and resistance, captivated Daniel for a few seconds that felt like eternity. With his chin raised and an indifferent expression, he approached, his leather shoes shining under the streetlights. Caroline looked up, meeting eyes that returned a cold yet empty gaze. "Would you like to have dinner with me?" Daniel asked, his voice flat. Caroline studied him, suspicious, searching for hidden intentions in the face of the man standing before her. But hunger and curiosity finally made her nod. As they walked toward the city's finest restaurant, the shadow of doubt and Daniel's pride followed closely behind, foreshadowing a night that would change more than either of them could imagine. The streets of the city were a mix of neon lights and shadows dancing in the corners, reflecting a contrast between opulence and desolation. Daniel Johnson walked with firm steps and a distant gaze, absorbed in his task of fulfilling the bet that had taken him out of his comfort zone. As he moved away from the club, the laughter and jokes of his friends faded, leaving room for a piercing silence. He felt the discomfort of someone about to do something outside their usual world of certainties. The cold air hit his face as he walked along the sidewalks, glistening from the recent rain. The luxury store windows reflected his figure, impeccable in his custom-made suit, projecting an image of success that, on this night, felt hollow. As his steps carried him to the darker parts of the city, his surroundings changed. The elegance of boutiques and expensive restaurants gave way to grey corners where figures crouched under blankets and cardboard, invisible to most passers-by. It was on one of those corners where Daniel first saw Caroline. She played a violin that had seen better days, but the music emanating from it was so beautiful it seemed to defy the harshness of her surroundings. The notes rose with a melancholy that captured Daniel, making him stop. For a few seconds, the music erased the lines of his routine life and left him exposed, vulnerable to a feeling he couldn't name. Caroline, with disheveled hair and worn clothes, sensed Daniel's presence before looking up. Her eyes, dark and filled with untold stories, met his. In Daniel's gaze, there was no compassion, only a distant curiosity that puzzled her. She kept the bow raised for a moment, letting the last note linger in the air before slowly lowering the violin. "Do you need anything?" Caroline asked, her tone trying to sound strong, yet revealing the distrust that protected her. Daniel cleared his throat, aware that the words he was about to say sounded absurd, even to him. "Would you like to have dinner with me?" he said, with a voice so neutral it could have been a business transaction. Caroline observed him, looking for intentions behind this unusual offer. She was used to kind words being followed by hidden agendas. However, hunger and curiosity fought against her instinct of distrust. She nodded briefly, and he turned around, walking toward the restaurant without waiting for her to follow. Caroline put away her violin, her fingers trembling, and began walking behind him, feeling the weight of the occasional glances from the few passers-by. The restaurant they arrived at was a temple of exclusivity, with large glass doors, a marble floor that reflected the golden lights of chandeliers, and waiters dressed in impeccable black. When they entered, the sound of conversation and clinking glasses momentarily silenced, giving way to a quiet filled with surprise. All eyes turned to Caroline, who felt the judgment of every pair of eyes like a thorn. Daniel moved forward without hesitation, as if he didn't notice the reaction of others. He led her to a secluded table and sat across from her, arms crossed. The menu was in front of him, but he didn't look at it. Caroline, still standing, hesitated before sitting, trying to ignore the stares from the waiters, who seemed to be debating whether or not they should intervene. The waiter finally approached, his professional smile not quite masking his surprise. "Are you ready to order?" he asked, casting a quick glance at Caroline, whose face was flushed with discomfort. Daniel, without looking up, ordered his usual dish, a gesture as automatic as breathing. Caroline, after a moment of doubt, ordered something simple, her voice trembling. When the waiter left, the silence between them grew thick. Daniel looked around, avoiding Caroline's gaze and seeking distraction in anything, while she kept her eyes lowered, feeling every whisper and every stare as a weight on her shoulders. Determined to break the tension that made her feel so small, Caroline lifted her gaze and spoke in a barely audible whisper. "Thank you for the dinner." Daniel, surprised by Caroline's voice, turned toward her for the first time since they entered. Something in her simple yet dignified gratitude disarmed him. He didn't respond, but for a moment a shadow passed through his eyes, something he couldn't recognize. Caroline, not receiving a response, decided to fill the silence by telling a bit of her story. She spoke of her mother, who had taken her to a small music school, and how the violin was all that remained of a past that had once been bright. As she spoke, Daniel noticed that her voice, though shaky, was strong, filled with memories that, unintentionally, began to crack the walls he had built around his emotions. Outside, the city lights flickered and the night continued its course. But inside that restaurant, at a secluded table, two opposing worlds began to brush against each other, marking the beginning of a change neither of them had anticipated. The restaurant, usually filled with noisy conversations and the soft clinking of glasses, was quieter than usual. Daniel, sitting across from Caroline, maintained a rigid posture, arms crossed over his chest. He couldn't remember the last time a dinner had made him feel so out of place. In his business meetings, control was his, but in this moment, with the young stranger in front of him, everything felt different. Caroline took a deep breath, her gaze still lowered, as though searching for an answer or comfort in the texture of the table. But the discomfort pushed her to speak, to make this dinner, which had started as a bad joke, have some purpose. She lifted her eyes and met Daniel's, cold but curious, as if waiting for something without knowing exactly what. "When I was a child, my mother took me to a music school," she began, her voice trembling at first, but slowly gaining strength. "It was small, barely a classroom in a church, but to me, it was the whole world. I played the violin while she worked at the textile factory. She always came back for me, her hands full of scars, but her smile, I never forgot it." Daniel, who had been looking around to avoid her gaze, found himself listening intently. He hadn't expected Caroline to speak, and even less so that her story would draw his interest. Something in her words touched him, awakening a distant echo of feelings he hadn't allowed to surface in a long time. "And your father?" he asked, before he could stop himself. Caroline gave a sad smile, as if that question unlocked even more painful memories. "He was a carpenter. He had strong hands, but he always used them to build things, not just furniture, but memories. He used to hug me after my little concerts. He was the first to clap, even if there were only 5 people in the audience." Her voice cracked slightly as she said this. "But an accident took both of them from me." The weight of those words fell on the table like a heavy cloak, filling the space between them with an almost tangible tension. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unable to look away. He had heard stories of loss and sacrifice in his business dealings, but never with such closeness and sincerity. For the first time, his thoughts, usually cold and calculating, were tangled, trying to understand how someone so young had endured so much. Caroline continued, as if letting those words out was a necessary relief. "After the accident, I tried to keep the house, but the debts came faster than the help. I trusted someone who promised to help me manage my parents' insurance, but he turned out to be a fraud. Not only did I lose the house, but also any security I had left. I ended up here, on the streets, with my violin as the only witness to what I was." Silence once again took over the space. Daniel felt a pang in his chest, something he recognized as empathy, an emotion he rarely allowed himself. His eyes, which had previously regarded Caroline as a passing curiosity, now looked at her with a different, more human attention. However, before he could say anything, the door to the restaurant swung open. The sound of laughter and confident footsteps shattered the bubble that had formed around them. Mark and Olivia entered, bringing with them a blast of expensive perfume and the toxic familiarity of their world. Their gazes landed on Daniel and the figure accompanying him. Mark frowned for a moment, surprised, but then a cynical smile appeared on his face. He moved toward the table, followed by Olivia, who raised an eyebrow with curiosity and disdain. "Daniel! Wow, I thought the bet would stay a story, but I see you actually followed through, Mark said with a laugh that echoed through the room, drawing stares. Olivia, in her perfect silk dress, looked at Caroline with a mix of pity and contempt. So, how's dinner? Interesting company, I imagine. Their words and laughter were sharp, and Caroline, who had kept her head up until then, felt the judgment of these strangers pierce her skin. But she didn't lower her gaze. She didn't want to give them that victory. Daniel, for the first time, felt that his friend's jokes were a reminder of everything that was wrong in his life. He didn't smile or join Mark's ironic game. A part of him, which he had been ignoring until then, rebelled against the superficiality of his surroundings. The dinner continued, but the silence was no longer the same. Caroline finished her dish without looking at Daniel or the intruders who briefly sat with them. Mark and Olivia, finding no amusement in the discomfort, left with bland comments and mechanical laughter, leaving Daniel and Caroline alone again in a space that now felt colder and emptier. Daniel stared at the empty chair across from him, and for the first time in years, the weight of his own life felt unbearable. The days following the uncomfortable dinner were a blur of images and thoughts that Daniel couldn't shake from his mind. Caroline's words resonated like a persistent echo, blurring the outlines of the comfortable, empty routine he had lived in for years. Even the most important meetings, those that decided million-dollar investments, turned into a tangled mess of repeated phrases and faceless people. Inside, something stirred, pushing him in a direction he didn't quite understand. One afternoon, without thinking too much, he found himself in front of the shelter where Caroline stayed. It was an old building, with bricks worn down by time, and a metal door that creaked when opened. Daniel had never seen a place like this, and the contrast with the luxury offices and marble-decorated halls he was used to was striking. He took a deep breath before pushing the door open. The sound of children's laughter and low murmurs greeted him as he entered. A group of people shared a small table, handing out bread and cups of soup. It was a humble environment, but filled with a warmth Daniel hadn't expected to find. An old man with a white beard and eyes full of wisdom told a story to a couple of children who watched him with fascination. Matthew, a former literature teacher, was the storyteller. His words flowed with a quiet cadence, and the peace he radiated filled the room. Daniel moved awkwardly, trying not to draw attention. It wasn't long before Caroline noticed him from across the room. Their eyes met, and her surprise turned into a cautious expression. However, Caroline didn't approach. She simply observed him, wondering what he was doing there. The shelter was far from luxurious, but it had something that Daniel's gleaming offices didn't possess: life. There were children laughing and playing, elderly people sharing stories, and adults working together to maintain a space where hope could survive, even if just barely. Daniel took a couple of steps and was greeted by a robust, smiling woman wearing an apron. She gave him a curious look before offering a kind smile. "How can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice warm and filled with genuine interest. Daniel cleared his throat, uncomfortable because he didn't have a clear answer. He looked around, observing the people who were sharing what little they had. "I just wanted to have a look, see if I could help with anything," he responded, the words sounding strange even to him. Matthew, who had finished his story, approached the newcomer. His walk was slow, but his presence carried a natural calm. "Everyone is welcome here," said Matthew, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "It doesn't matter where you come from, but what you're willing to give." The words resonated with Daniel in a way he hadn't expected. The elderly man introduced him to some of the residents, including Anna, a little girl with curly hair and bright eyes, who was practicing dance moves in a corner. The young girl quickly dragged him into an activity of cutting paper to make garlands. Daniel, who had always viewed time as a resource that should be used with precision, found himself smiling and awkwardly participating in the simple game. As Daniel slowly became integrated into the shelter's routine, Caroline watched from a corner. Her hands trembled as she folded the clean clothes that others had brought as donations. Seeing Daniel there, Laughing with Anna and listening attentively to Matthew's stories confused her. The last time she had seen him, the coldness in his eyes reminded her of how distant he was from the reality she knew. Now she wasn't sure what to think. Daniel's first visit to the shelter was brief, but it left an impression. The residents, although initially distrustful because of his presence and his suit, which marked him as someone from another world, began to accept his help. He returned again and again, bringing food and supplies, using his contacts to bring more donations to the place. Matthew, with his calm wisdom, became an unexpected mentor to Daniel. He told him stories of heroes and villains, of tough decisions and sacrifices, lessons that resonated with a truth that reached deep inside the businessman. Anna, with her carefree laugh and her ability to laugh even in the hardest times, became a symbol of everything that could be changed with a little kindness and effort. Caroline, although still maintaining some distance, couldn't help but notice the change in Daniel. But deep down, distrust persisted. She had seen too many empty promises and fleeting gestures of kindness that faded over time. As she watched him, one question haunted her. How long would it take before he realized that this wasn't his world and simply walked away, taking with him the hope that, unintentionally, had begun to awaken? Daniel's days became a delicate balance between two worlds that slowly began to mix in his mind and heart. In the morning, he wore his perfectly tailored suits and attended meetings where million-dollar figures and colossal projects were decided. In the afternoon, his life changed pace, and his visits to the shelter wrapped him in a warmth he hadn't known before. Anna's laughter and Matthew's stories filled the silences that were once reserved for cold calculations and business strategies. However, this transition wasn't easy. His actions didn't go unnoticed by Mark, who, noticing the increasing absence of his friend from social gatherings and high society events, began to suspect. The relationship between them slowly began to tense. At a business lunch, Mark leaned toward Daniel with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Seems like you've been busy, Johnson. It's been a while since we've had a good poker game or a night at the club. Is there something more interesting than our little bets?" Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the glass of water he was turning in his hands. He could feel the weight of Mark's insinuation and the veiled threat hidden in his words. He knew his friend well. Mark wasn't someone who accepted changes in their circle's dynamic without investigating them thoroughly. "I've had things to take care of, Mark. Not everything is about cards and drinks," Daniel replied, trying to sound casual, but the tension in his voice betrayed him. Olivia, who had been listening to the conversation from across the table, decided to intervene. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of curiosity and reproach. "Daniel, darling, you've been distant lately. You know we've always supported you, but some of us are starting to wonder if you're okay," she said, with a smile that tried to mask the criticism. Daniel felt a wave of frustration rise in his chest. The life he had led until then, full of false loyalties and calculated smiles, was starting to lose its meaning in the simplicity of the shelter and the people who lived there. However, he wasn't ready to explain his change. Not yet. In the afternoon, after the workday and the tense encounter with his friends, Daniel headed to the shelter. This time, he wasn't just bringing donations. He carried a more relaxed and open expression. Upon entering, he was greeted by a scene that made him stop. Anna was dancing in a corner, with small and clumsy steps, while a group of residents watched and laughed. The little girl looked up, and upon seeing him, ran toward him with the spontaneity of someone seeing an old friend. "Look, Daniel, I'm practicing for the performance we're going to have next month," she said, with a smile that lit up her face. Anna's laughter and the energy in the place made the weight of the morning dissolve. For a moment, Daniel felt free from the expectations and judgments of the outside world. He crouched down to Anna's height and applauded, genuinely impressed. "You're doing great, Anna. I'd love to see that performance," he replied, feeling a warmth he hadn't remembered feeling in years. Caroline, who was watching the scene from the small kitchen of the shelter, felt a mix of emotions. Seeing Daniel interact with Anna and the others, laughing and shedding his businessman's shell, was something she hadn't expected. And while a part of her wanted to believe in his change, distrust still lingered, waiting for a reason to justify her skepticism. As Daniel became more involved in the shelter's activities, his posture and body language changed. He relaxed, and his gestures reflected something more human, more approachable. It wasn't long before some of the residents stopped seeing him as a stranger and started considering him one of their own. However, Caroline kept her distance, unable to forget the past and the scars she carried. One evening, while Matthew was telling a story to the younger ones about heroes who found their true mission in the least expected places, Caroline approached Daniel. There was something in her eyes that mixed curiosity and suspicion. "Why are you here, Daniel?" she asked, breaking the silence that had formed between them for weeks. Daniel held her gaze, feeling that this time there was no easy answer. "At first I didn't know. It was just a bet I had to fulfill. But now," he paused, searching for the words, "now I think I'm looking for something more, something I lost a long time ago, or maybe something I never had." Caroline nodded slightly, without saying anything more, and walked away. His words left her thinking, like a melody she couldn't stop hearing. As she walked back to her place in the shelter, Daniel felt for the first time that the balance between his two lives was beginning to tip. What he didn't know was that his change wouldn't go unnoticed, and that those who feared losing him would do whatever necessary to pull him back onto the path he had always followed. The routine at the shelter had become a sort of anchor for Daniel, an emotional refuge where he found a purpose that went beyond numbers and cold transactions. However, the peace he had begun to experience was interrupted by a growing murmur of doubts and secrets. The days at his company were becoming more tense. Mark's inquisitive stares and Olivia's veiled comments increased the pressure. Daniel noticed how his usual environment was starting to view him as an enigma, and it didn't take long before he realized that he couldn't keep his double life going for much longer. One autumn afternoon, when the leaves were falling in golden swirls, Caroline was tidying up the small office at the shelter. It was a simple space, with shelves filled with old folders and documents that had been donated or rescued from abandoned offices. As she sorted through a pile of yellowed papers, her hands stopped on a worn folder whose contents seemed out of place. When she opened it, a couple of sheets slipped to the floor. Caroline quickly bent down and picked up the documents. As her eyes scanned the headings and corporate stamps, her breath quickened. The familiarity of the name that appeared on them was undeniable: Johnson Holdings. The papers detailed operations and contracts, mentioning a subsidiary that, years earlier, had been involved in the fraud that destroyed her life. The shelter blurred around her as she read the details. The betrayal she had felt when discovering the scam, the fear, the desperation, and the loneliness of those days came rushing back like a wave, shaking her to her core. The sound of children's laughter and voices around her faded as Caroline, trembling, walked toward the main room where Daniel was playing with Anna and other children. Her fingers, still clutching the papers, tightened with a mixture of pain and fury. She watched him for a moment, his figure fitting into an environment she had once considered safe, now stained by doubt and betrayal. Daniel looked up and noticed Caroline standing in the doorway, holding the papers with an expression that made him frown. He knew, the instant their eyes met, that something was terribly wrong. "Caroline, is everything okay?" he asked, stopping his activity and approaching cautiously. She extended the papers toward him, saying nothing, her dark eyes now a battleground between disbelief and repressed rage. Daniel took the documents and began to read. As his eyes moved over the words, a cold sensation gripped him. He recognized the subsidiary's name. He had signed documents related to it, but he had never looked into the details or investigated what it meant for those affected. "I didn't know," Daniel murmured, more to himself than to Caroline, as he looked up to meet her probing gaze. "You didn't know," she repeated, her bitterness cutting through him. "That changes nothing, Daniel. This destroyed my life and many others. What am I supposed to do now with your ignorance?" The silence that followed was thick, like a blanket covering words neither of them could speak. Caroline took a step back, still watching him, then turned on her heels and left, without waiting for a response. Daniel followed her with his gaze, feeling how the weight of the papers in his hands became a symbol of all the things he had ignored, of all the lives that had been ruined while he signed contracts in lavish offices. That night, Daniel didn't return to his penthouse. Instead, he headed to Elena's house, his secretary and confidant, a woman who had worked for his family for decades and knew more secrets than he was willing to accept. Elena greeted him with a mixture of surprise and concern. She knew that Daniel's visits to her modest but welcoming home were always a sign of something important. "Elena, I need your help," he said, his voice lower and more broken than he remembered ever using. He pulled out the documents and showed them to her. "I need to know everything about these contracts, the subsidiary, and who was behind this." Elena, with her tired but alert eyes, put on her glasses and reviewed the papers. She frowned as she read, and when she finished, she looked at him with a seriousness she rarely displayed. "Daniel, what you're looking for will lead you to things you might prefer not to know. This is not just an administrative mistake. It's a deliberate fraud, and the trail leads to the company, even to your father," she whispered, lowering her gaze to avoid the pain she knew was reflected in her boss's face. Daniel's world seemed to tilt. His father, the architect of Johnson Holdings, the man whose approval he had pursued all his life, had been involved in a scheme that not only gave wealth to the company, but had ruined innocent lives, including Caroline's. And Mark, his old friend, had managed it all, covering the tracks and manipulating the details. Hours passed in Elena's house, reviewing more files, forgotten documents in boxes, and records that should never have seen the light. Daniel felt that each page he examined was a blow that pushed him deeper into the abyss of betrayal and guilt. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Caroline tried to control the torrent of emotions overwhelming her. Matthew, the wise old man, approached in silence, his slow and steady walk. He looked at her with understanding and a slight sadness. "Painful truths are like thorns, Caroline. They can tear you apart if you carry them too close to your heart. But they can also be the seed of something new if you plant them carefully," he said, in a tone that didn't demand a response, but planted a thought. Caroline looked away, her thoughts spinning around Matthew's words and the emptiness she felt when thinking about Daniel. She had wanted to believe in his change, that he was different, but now everything was shaking. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the shelter, no longer wearing his immaculate suit or his usual distant demeanor. He wore a face marked by lack of sleep and worry. He searched for Caroline but didn't find her. However, Matthew approached with the wisdom of someone who understands that internal storms are necessary. "Sometimes facing the truth is the first step to changing it, Daniel. It won't be easy, but if it's real, you won't stop until it's done," he told him, his words hitting Daniel's soul like a hammer on an anvil. Daniel nodded, knowing he had to make a decision, one that would jeopardize everything he knew, but was the only way to find redemption and maybe regain Caroline's trust. The morning arrived with a grey, heavy sky, as if the city reflected the weight pressing on Daniel Johnson's heart. He had stayed up all night, the documents still scattered across the table in his living room, each sheet an accusation buzzing in his ears like a constant echo. The figures, names, and dates intertwined in his mind, forming a tangled mess of decisions that pushed him toward an unknown abyss. The sound of his phone pulled him out of his thoughts. It was Mark. The call stretched out like a warning of the inevitable. Daniel stared at it, hesitating, and finally answered. "Daniel, I've noticed you've been distracted lately," Mark said, with that slick voice he always used to mask his true intentions. Everything okay? You know that if there's something I should know, I'd rather hear it from you. All good, Mark. Just work. You know how it is, Daniel responded, controlling the tremor in his voice. The silence on the other end of the line was brief, but unsettling. I hope so, my friend. If you need anything, I'm here, Mark concluded, before hanging up with a coldness that made the words feel like a warning. Daniel set the phone aside and closed his eyes, trying to calm the internal storm. He knew the hours ahead would be crucial. With Elena's help, he had confirmed what he feared. His father and Mark had been the authors of the fraud that ruined Caroline's life and many other families. Now, he had to decide whether to keep hiding the truth and protect the family legacy, or expose everything and risk his position, his fortune, and maybe even his safety. Throughout the day, Daniel's thoughts became a constant back and forth between guilt and the need for justice. The images of Caroline standing in the shelter with the papers trembling in her hands and the expression on Matthew's face, filled with severe compassion, haunted him. He knew he had reached the limit. He could no longer hide behind excuses or delegate responsibility. That night, Daniel called Elena and asked her to come to his penthouse. The woman, who had known Daniel since he was a child, arrived with the calm of someone who had endured decades of secrets and difficult truths. They sat in the living room, surrounded by documents and the dim light of a lamp that seemed to flicker in rhythm with their thoughts. Elena, if I take this step, I'll lose everything, Daniel said, his voice broken by exhaustion and doubt. Not just the company. I'll lose the trust of the people who once respected me, and maybe even my own family. The woman looked at him with understanding, her eyes firm, the lines on her face deepening as she nodded slowly. Daniel, the real question is, do you want to keep being the shadow of your father and Mark, or do you want to build something you can look at with pride? What you do now will define who you are, not just for others, but for yourself. Elena's words resonated in the silence of the room, and Daniel knew he had his answer. It was as if an old, deep weight had started to lift from his shoulders. However, the decision did not erase the fear. He knew that facing Mark and his father's legacy would mean lighting a fire in a field full of dynamite. The following week, Daniel began preparing his presentation. He gathered documents, ensured he had irrefutable proof, and surrounded himself with a small group of allies who trusted him. Among them, Eleanor played a key role, searching for lost files and recovering data that would demonstrate Mark's manipulation and his father's questionable decisions. Every night, after hours of reviewing papers and confirming details, Daniel would stop by the shelter, even if only for a few minutes. He didn't speak with Caroline, who still kept her distance, but seeing the life unfolding there gave him the strength to carry on. The day of the meeting with the board arrived with palpable tension in the air. The Johnson Holdings building, majestic and surrounded by glass columns, seemed like a fortress that had, until that moment, protected the family legacy. Daniel entered in a dark suit, his footsteps echoing on the marble as employees greeted him with respectful, curious glances. No one knew what was about to happen. The boardroom was full. Board members, investors, and top executives whispered among themselves, the noise dying down when Daniel entered. At the end of the long mahogany table, Mark watched him with a superficial smile, while some of his father's old allies showed expectant faces. "Thank you all for coming today," Daniel began, his voice steady but with an imperceptible tremor. He placed the documents on the table and continued. "What I'm about to present will change our perception of the company, of what we've been and what we want to be." As the words left his mouth, revealing the fraud and Mark and his father's involvement, the room erupted in a mixture of murmurs, exclamations, and looks of disbelief. Daniel showed each piece of evidence, detailing how the contracts and agreements had ruined entire families and filled the coffers of Johnson Holdings. Mark, whose face had transformed into a mask of tension and fury, stood up, interrupting the presentation. "What the hell are you doing, Daniel? Do you want to destroy everything your father built?" he yelled, trying to downplay the situation. Daniel stared at him, feeling a calm he hadn't felt in a long time. "I want to rebuild it, Mark, but with integrity. This can't stay buried. We can't keep benefiting from the suffering of others." The board was divided. Some supported Mark and questioned Daniel, while others, impressed by the evidence, remained silent, unable to take sides at that moment. When the meeting ended, Daniel knew he had planted the seed for change, though he didn't know how many would be willing to accept it. Mark left the room without looking at him, but Daniel felt his shadow as a promise of future confrontation. He knew he had challenged a man with no limits to his ambition, and the reaction wouldn't take long to come. That night, as he left the building, the cold city air hit him like a release. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, felt free from the chains that had kept him imprisoned. He knew the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles, but he had taken the first step towards something worth it, something that might bring him closer to Caroline and the redemption he longed for. The shelter greeted him with its usual bustle of life. Children ran and laughed, and Matthew greeted him with a knowing smile, as if he knew what he had done. Caroline, seeing him, looked at him from a distance, and though her expression still carried a shadow of skepticism, there was also a glimmer of something different, a hint of hope. Days after the meeting where Daniel exposed the corruption at the heart of Johnson Holdings, the atmosphere in the building remained tense. The offices, usually filled with shallow conversations and the clinking of coffee cups, now seemed like a sea of murmurs and furtive glances. The employees, accustomed to the security of working for a stable empire, now walked with caution, afraid of the repercussions the revelation might trigger. Mark, for his part, had disappeared from public view, which only added to the tension. Daniel knew that the calm following the storm was deceptive. Mark wasn't someone who accepted defeat without a fight, and his silence foretold a counterattack. At the shelter, the news of Daniel's confrontation with the board had spread. Caroline heard about it from Matthew, who, as always, listened to the news with an attentive ear and shared the information with a knowing smile. Caroline felt a mixture of confusion and respect, emotions that intertwined in her mind every time she thought of Daniel. Despite everything, distrust still nestled in her heart, a reminder of the wounds time hadn't fully healed. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the dusty windows of the shelter, Daniel appeared at the door. He wasn't wearing a suit or the calculated confidence that usually accompanied him. He dressed simply, his face marked by exhaustion and a determination that made him look different. Matthew greeted him from his seat by the window, where he was flipping through an old book of poetry. "Daniel, you're back," the elderly man said, with a smile that was wiser than cheerful. Caroline, who was organizing a shelf with children's books, glanced at Daniel. His presence unsettled her. A part of her wanted to approach, ask, hear what he had done and why. But she stayed where she was, struggling against the need to protect herself. "Yes, Matthew. I've come back because I haven't finished what I started," Daniel replied, and though his voice was calm, it carried a weight that everyone in the room felt. Silence settled in as the others at the shelter looked at him curiously. Some remembered the suited man who had first arrived, as if he were a stranger from another world. Others, the younger ones, only saw a man who brought something new, maybe hope, maybe trouble. "And what is it you've started, Daniel?" asked Matthew, without taking his eyes off him. "Changing what's wrong, not just in my company but in myself," Daniel said, and his words resonated in the room with a sincerity that made Caroline look up for a moment. There was something different about him, something she hadn't seen before. Daniel's visits to the shelter became more frequent. He helped with supplies, talked to Matthew about stories of redemption and learning, and played with the children, who accepted him without the reservations the adults still had. Caroline, though still observing from a distance, began to notice small details. The way Daniel listened to others, how he helped Anna perfect her dance steps, or how he stayed late, cleaning tables and organizing materials with a tired smile. One night, after an activity where the residents shared their life stories, Daniel stayed at the shelter as everyone else went to rest. Caroline, still collecting the cups and plates from dinner, sensed his presence before she saw him. Daniel approached, and the silence that surrounded them was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was as if both of them were waiting for the other to take the first step. "Caroline, what I did at the company was for you, for all the people who lost what was theirs," he said, breaking the silence with a deep and honest voice. Caroline stopped collecting the plates and looked at him directly. In her eyes was a challenge, a flash of pain and questions that still had no answers. "And what do you expect me to do with that, Daniel? Should I thank you and have everything erased?" she asked, with a hardness that masked the vulnerability she was trying to protect. Daniel sighed, feeling the weight of Caroline's words like a blow. He slowly shook his head. "I don't expect you to thank me or for everything to be fixed overnight. I just want you to know that I'm willing to do everything I can to change, to repair the damage that was done." The silence stretched on, and Caroline felt the emotions she had tried to contain stirring within her. For years she had fought to maintain her dignity, to not let anyone or anything break the fortress she had built. But seeing Daniel, broken and sincere, awakened something in her that she hadn't expected. "It's not easy to trust, Daniel. And it's not easy to forget either," she finally said, her voice softer. "But maybe, just maybe, I can learn to see what you're doing." The relief Daniel felt was so intense, it almost took his breath away. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an ajar door. It was enough for now. The days that followed were a mix of work at the shelter and confrontations at the company. Mark, who had kept his distance, began to take action. Small obstacles appeared in Daniel's projects. Important client calls were cancelled, and rumors began to circulate among the employees. Daniel knew Mark was making his moves, and the silent war was growing more dangerous by the day. One afternoon, as Daniel reviewed documents in his makeshift office at the shelter, he received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, the voice on the other end chilled him to the bone. "I hope you're enjoying your days as a redeemer, Daniel, because soon everything you love will crumble." Mark's voice was calm, calculated, and the threat in his words was clear. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. He had underestimated Mark, and now he knew the price of his actions might be higher than he had imagined. However, as he looked out the window and saw the children playing and Caroline watching with a mix of sadness and hope, he knew he had taken the only path that was worth it. The battle was just beginning, and Daniel was ready to face whatever came, as long as it meant protecting what, without realizing it, he had started to love. The weeks following Daniel's revelation at the board meeting were a whirlwind of reactions and changes at Johnson Holdings and in Daniel's life. The news of the fraud and the involvement of key figures in the company, including the shadow of his own father, shook the city's business community. Newspapers, business blogs, and TV news analyzed the story from every possible angle. The reputation of Johnson Holdings teetered on the brink of the abyss, along with the legacy that had kept the Johnson family at the top for decades. Daniel faced a tide of challenges. Some shareholders, fearful of the repercussions, began to pull out, selling their shares and triggering a stock market drop that eroded the value of the company. Meanwhile, Mark, like a cornered snake, moved his pieces stealthily. A small group of executives loyal to him tried to discredit Daniel, claiming his revelation was nothing more than a desperate attempt to redeem himself after alleged poor management decisions. Mark's narrative was that Daniel was dragging the company into ruin with his personal crusade. Olivia, for her part, began to distance herself from Daniel, first subtly and then more openly. Meetings at exclusive clubs and social events became places where whispers of criticism and judgment were exchanged. Some of Daniel's old friends, who had once looked at him with admiration, now saw him with a mix of disapproval and pity. High society didn't forgive easily, and his betrayal of the secrets of his own environment was seen as a weakness, an unforgivable sin. In the midst of this storm, Daniel found refuge in the least expected place, the community shelter where Caroline, Matthew, Anna, and the other residents continued with their lives, fighting every day to overcome difficulties. There, surrounded by faces that didn't judge him by the headlines, Daniel felt more like himself than he had ever felt. The hours he spent helping, organizing activities, and collaborating in the kitchen or with donation organization were a balm in the middle of the chaos. One day, while Daniel was unloading food boxes that a company had donated to the shelter, Matthew approached him. The elderly man had been watching him with the calmness of someone who has seen many lives pass, and his gaze radiated a deep understanding. "Daniel, the price of truth is high, but in every story the heroes who seek the truth never end up the same as they started," Matthew said, his words resonating with the gravity of experience. Daniel nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead and letting out a sigh. Every day that passed, he felt his life drifting farther from what he had known. The meetings filled with numbers and immaculate presentations were now just an echo in his memory. "I'm not looking to be a hero, Matthew. I'm just trying to do the right thing," he replied, with a mixture of exhaustion and sincerity. "And that, Daniel, is what makes you one, even if you don't see it," the elderly man said, before moving away to continue helping others in the room. Caroline, who had been observing the interaction from across the room, approached Daniel for the first time in weeks. She had seen the reports, read the news, and heard the murmurs reaching the shelter. She knew Daniel was paying a high price for his decision, but she still had questions, doubts that didn't dissipate easily. "I've seen what you're doing for the shelter, and I've heard what you did at the meeting. But why? Why risk everything, even when you knew it could destroy you?" she asked, her tone softer than usual, but still tinged with the distrust that protected her. Daniel looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the shadow of a man who had changed more than she could have imagined. "I did it because I realized I couldn't keep living a lie, Caroline. I saw what happened to your family, what happened to so many others, and I realized that the only way to find some peace was to stop being part of the problem, no matter the cost," he said, his words filled with the sincerity she had been waiting for in him. Caroline nodded slowly, not breaking eye contact. A part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to see that Daniel's actions weren't just a farce or a tactic to redeem himself superficially. The road to forgiveness and trust wasn't easy, but for the first time, she felt there was space for possibility. As the days passed, Daniel began to see the fruits of his efforts, though in ways he had never anticipated. A couple of small businesses, inspired by his act of bravery, joined together to donate resources to the shelter and other charitable organizations. Some employees from Johnson Holdings, moved by his example, began offering their time as volunteers in the community. Daniel's name, once synonymous with success and coldness, began to be associated with words like commitment and change. But the fight with Mark was far from over. One night, as Daniel was returning to the shelter after a long day, he received an anonymous call. "You thought this was over, but it's just beginning. I'm going to make you pay for every cent you've made me lose, for every partner who's deserted." Mark's voice sounded controlled, but with a tone that revealed his simmering rage. "And you won't be the only one who pays." Daniel's heart raced, not because he feared losing what little fortune or position he had left, but because he feared that the shelter, Caroline, and the people who now meant so much to him would become the target of Mark's revenge. The sun was setting as he arrived at the shelter, and the golden light of the evening bathed the room where the children played, and Anna practiced a little dance. Caroline saw him enter, noticing the concern on his face, and approached. "What's going on, Daniel?" she asked, her voice starting to show sincere concern. "Mark won't let this go. And I'm afraid he'll go further than I thought," Daniel replied, his voice low. Caroline looked at him intently, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed a faint smile to cross her lips. "You're not alone in this. We all fight together here. And if what you did was sincere, then we'll face whatever comes. Together, she said, placing a hand on his arm. Daniel felt a wave of emotion flood through him. For the first time, he realized that he had found something that could not be measured in money or titles. A sense of belonging. A family that, although broken and battered, was willing to support him. The battle was not over yet, but with Caroline's promise and the strength of the shelter by his side, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. The air at the shelter was filled with activity. The conversations and laughter of the children mixed with the soft creaking of chairs and the bustle of hands working. Despite the challenges, the place held onto its essence, a space of resilience, a sanctuary where every small achievement was celebrated with the joy of those who take nothing for granted. Daniel stood in a corner, reviewing the list of donations and contacts he had managed to consolidate since his decision to confront the corruption at his company. The list, though modest, was a tangible symbol of what he had started to build, a new life based on principles he had long forgotten or ignored. Yet, the echo of Mark's threat still reverberated in his mind, a reminder that the peace he was beginning to experience was fragile and dangerous. Caroline watched him from the makeshift kitchen where she helped prepare dinner for the residents. Though her face retained the serenity she was known for, within her, a constant battle between skepticism and hope raged on. Daniel's actions were visible, undeniable, but the road to forgiveness was steep and thorny. She could not yet erase the memory of the nights of hunger and cold, the dark days after losing everything. But every time she saw Daniel, working with a dedication that seemed sincere, a part of her wanted to give in, allow herself to believe in redemption. That afternoon, Matthew decided to organize a special activity, a night of stories. The residents would gather to share tales, anecdotes, and stories, an event he called the Night of Voices, where the past and present would meet through storytelling. Matthew, with his usual wisdom, knew it was a necessary moment to unite the community and heal open wounds. As night fell, the chairs were arranged in a circle, and flickering candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. Daniel sat next to Anna, who couldn't stop moving her feet, excited about the opportunity to tell a story she had been practicing for weeks. Caroline, with her hands on her lap and attentive eyes, watched as the room filled with voices and laughter. "Welcome to another Night of Voices," Matthew announced, his deep, soothing voice resonating in the room. "Today, we'll share stories that have made us who we are, because no matter how hard the road has been, we're still here, together." The first turn was Anna's, who stood up and told a story about a little princess who, despite living in a fallen kingdom with no riches, found treasure in her ability to dream and laugh. Her childlike voice and the seriousness with which she spoke each word brought smiles and applause. Daniel, watching the girl with a warm smile, felt his heart fill with something new, something he couldn't describe in words. One by one, the residents shared stories of losses and discoveries, moments that had defined their lives. When it was Caroline's turn, a hushed silence fell over the room. She stood with the grace of someone who has learned to stand firm despite the storms. She looked into the eyes of everyone present before starting. "I want to tell you the story of how music saved me," she began, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "When I was a child, my mother taught me that life isn't always fair, but that we can always find beauty in the most unexpected places. I learned to play the violin at a small school, and every note that came from my fingers was a refuge, a way to connect with what I had lost." Daniel, listening with the attention of someone seeking answers, felt Caroline's words touch something deep inside him. It wasn't just her story, it was a reminder of everything he, with his past indifference, had contributed to destroying. "But one day I lost everything," Caroline continued, and a soft murmur swept through the room. "A fraud, a betrayal, and I was left without a home, without a family, with nothing but the violin I carried with me. For a long time, I wondered if I would ever be able to trust again, if I would ever find a place to call home. Daniel's eyes met Caroline's, and in that moment, she didn't look away. There was a silent exchange, a conversation without words that laid bare both of their vulnerabilities. Caroline, with a soft sigh, concluded her story. Today, I'm still searching for answers, but I've learned that music, life, and people can surprise you in ways you never imagined. The room filled with a silence that seemed to have life of its own. Matthew, knowing the emotions were raw, took the floor to thank everyone and end the night. However, Daniel stood up before the meeting could dissolve. The eyes of the room turned toward him, curious and surprised. "I'd like to say something," he said, in a tone that left no room for doubt. The murmurs stopped, and everyone waited expectantly. Daniel took a deep breath and looked at Caroline before speaking. "When I came here, it was because of a bet. A night I lost, and out of pride, I decided to fulfill a promise that meant nothing to me. But what I found here, in this place, and in each of you, changed me more than I can express," he said, and his voice, filled with sincerity, resonated in every corner of the room. Daniel continued, recounting how his world of business and ambition had lost meaning after meeting the stories and people at the shelter. He spoke of his struggle to expose the truth at Johnson Holdings, of the difficult decisions, and how he had learned to see things in a way he never imagined. "I know that for some of you, it's hard to believe in my change, and I understand. But I'm here to tell you that my commitment is real, not just to the shelter, but to each one of you, to Caroline, who taught me what dignity and struggle mean," he concluded, his eyes moistening slightly. The silence was long and heavy until Matthew, with a slight smile and a determined clap, broke the tension. Soon, the others joined in, and though the applause wasn't a roar, it was enough. Daniel felt that, although he hadn't earned full forgiveness, he had taken another step on that difficult path. As the night wore on and the residents began to disperse, Caroline approached Daniel. The room, now emptier and bathed in the soft light of the candles, felt intimate, like a space apart from the rest of the world. "Daniel, your words meant a lot," she said, her voice, though cautious, leaving space for hope. "I don't know if it's enough, Caroline, but I want you to know that I'll keep working on this, on myself." "I'm not giving up," he replied, and in his eyes she saw a spark of determination that hadn't been there before. Caroline nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had met him, she allowed a smile, though slight, to form on her face. "Maybe, with time, we can find a way to heal together," she said. And though it wasn't full forgiveness, it was the promise of a road to walk. The Night of Voices became a turning point, not only for Daniel and Caroline, but for the entire shelter. The words shared, the understood silences, and the sincere glances formed a stronger bond, a more united community. As the candles burned down and the shadows danced on the walls, Daniel felt that, for the first time in a long time, there was a possibility for redemption and a path toward forgiveness that, though uncertain, he was willing to walk. The dawn arrived with a sky tinged with soft blue, promising a clear and bright day. The city, with its hustle and daily rush, barely noticed the changes that, for Daniel and Caroline, marked a before and after. Weeks had passed since the Night of Voices, and things at the shelter were beginning to move in a direction few would have imagined months ago. Daniel kept returning, but this time, not just to help with the daily tasks, but to lead projects and plans that were revitalizing the place. The shelter, once a fragile and resource-deprived space, was starting to become a place where hope took form. Caroline found herself in the small music room they had set up in one of the empty rooms. The children gathered there to learn their first notes on instruments donated by others. Caroline's violin, carefully restored by one of the neighborhood carpenters, was the centerpiece. The children, who had once viewed the instrument as a curious object, now listened intently as she played soft melodies that filled the air with magic and promises. "Remember, Each note is like a word, Caroline told them with a smile as she adjusted the bow. Together they tell a story, and you can tell yours if you practice. From the door, Daniel watched the scene, feeling a pride and warmth that he didn't recognize but had learned to value. Caroline noticed him, and though it was still difficult for her to hold his gaze, this time she didn't look away as quickly. There was something between them that had changed. Mutual respect, a deep understanding that went beyond words. It was a fragile but solid foundation, built more on actions than promises. "You have a talent for teaching," Daniel said as he approached at the end of the class. The children dispersed with laughter, some trying to imitate the movements Caroline had shown them. She placed the violin in its case and shrugged, the shadow of a smile playing on her lips. "It's the first time I've tried. I guess it has to do with how much music has given me." Daniel nodded, his gaze warm and attentive. "I've been thinking about what you mentioned that night, about music saving you. I think it's time to give this place more than donations. I want the shelter to have a permanent art and music space, something that can inspire more people like you and the children." The proposal left Caroline speechless for a moment. The idea of a space where music and art could flourish was a dream she had never allowed herself to entertain. After losing everything, she had learned not to expect much, but Daniel, with his words and actions, was starting to break down that wall. "It would be incredible," she finally said, and in her eyes, Daniel saw a glimmer he had been hoping for. The news of the new project spread quickly through the shelter and beyond. Some volunteers from local businesses began donating construction materials, and artists and musicians from the community offered to collaborate. The place began to transform, and with each new painting on the wall or instrument that arrived, the shelter became a symbol of resilience and creativity. Meanwhile, the challenges didn't disappear. Johnson Holdings, now under media pressure and with Mark playing his final cards, was at a crossroads. Mark, with his cunning and resources, had managed to stay afloat despite the scandal. While he had lost some influence, he still had a group of loyal allies willing to follow him. One day, while Daniel was overseeing the construction of the art room, he received a text message from an unknown number. "You haven't seen the worst yet. Be careful with what you love." The brief message, loaded with an implied threat, made him clench his jaw. He knew Mark wouldn't give up without a fight, and the words were a reminder of what was at stake. Daniel didn't share the threat with anyone at the shelter, but that night, while everyone slept, he stayed awake, keeping watch from a corner of the main room. The shadows cast by the streetlights moved slowly, and the silence was thick. Every creak, every distant sound, made his senses tense. However, nothing happened. Still, the uncertainty kept him alert, knowing the danger hadn't dissipated. It had just momentarily hidden itself. The next morning, Caroline found him sitting in one of the chairs, his eyes red from exhaustion and an expression mixing determination and concern. She approached slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty room. "Daniel, did you sleep here?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He nodded, trying to mask his fatigue with a weak smile. "I didn't want to leave anything to chance. Things are still complicated at the company, and Mark is still a threat," he admitted plainly. Caroline sat down across from him, looking at him with a mix of gratitude and an emotion she had been trying to understand. Seeing Daniel willing to protect the shelter, her and the others, made her realize that his change wasn't superficial. It was real, and he was willing to risk everything for it. "You can't do it alone, Daniel. If there's one thing life has taught me, it's that we face things together, or not at all," she said, extending a hand to touch his. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. Daniel looked at her, and the weight of the past weeks, the struggles, the sacrifices, felt a little lighter. He nodded, gently squeezing Caroline's hand. The project progressed rapidly. The art room became a colorful space, decorated with murals painted by local artists and volunteers who shared the vision of a transformed shelter. Daniel wasn't just overseeing the activities, he was participating in them, helping to paint, fix instruments, and organize classes. Every brushstroke and every musical note became a reminder that life could change, and redemption was possible if fought for. One day, while Daniel was working on installing a new shelf in the art room, a man dressed in a dark suit, clearly out of place in the shelter, arrived. He introduced himself as a representative of the board at Johnson Holdings. The air in the room tensed instantly, and the residents who saw him enter began to murmur. "Daniel, we need to talk." "In private," the man said, in a tone that allowed no argument. Daniel wiped his hands and nodded, leading him to a secluded space. The representative looked at him with a mixture of admiration and reproach. "The company is in a critical situation. The board wants you to come back, to take control and stabilize everything before Mark finishes destroying what little is left." The proposal caught Daniel by surprise. Returning to Johnson Holdings meant confronting the epicenter of his former life, the place that had triggered his crisis and transformation. But it also represented an opportunity to make things right, to build a new legacy based on justice and truth. "I'll come back, but with conditions," Daniel finally said, his voice firm. "I don't want any more shadows or secrets. If I return, it will be on my terms, and with the company's renewed commitment to the community and truth." The representative, who hadn't expected such assurance, nodded after a moment of hesitation. "Whatever you ask, Daniel. We need you to set things right." When the news became public, reactions were mixed. Some saw it as a sign of redemption, others as a calculated return. But for Daniel, returning to Johnson Holdings wasn't surrender. It was the culmination of his transformation. The company that had once been a symbol of his hollow success would now become the banner of his new principles. That night, when the news reached the shelter, Caroline found him sitting on the threshold, looking at the stars. She approached, and this time she sat beside him in silence, letting the stillness of the night speak for them. "You're going back to Johnson Holdings," she said, not as a question, but with the certainty of someone who knows how to read gestures and silence. "Yes, but it will be different. I want it to be different," Daniel replied. And in his words, Caroline heard the truth she had been waiting for all along. They sat in silence, watching the starlight flicker, as if the universe approved of that moment. Caroline, breaking the final barrier of doubt, leaned in and rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but in it lay everything they had been through, all the struggles, the losses, and the new promises. The shelter, Johnson Holdings, and life itself were works in progress, and for the first time, Daniel and Caroline knew that, although the path was uncertain, they would walk it together, in search of a future filled with hope and new beginnings. The morning of the wedding arrived with fresh air and the sound of birds singing. The shelter was decorated with garlands of white lights and wildflowers, lovingly arranged by the hands of those who had found a home there. The courtyard, now renovated and transformed into a space of art and hope, had become the perfect setting for a celebration that symbolized the rebirth of two souls who, against all odds, had found their way back to themselves and to each other. Daniel was getting ready in one of the small rooms of the shelter. He wore a simple yet elegant suit, very different from the ostentatious outfits he used to wear in his past life. His reflection in the mirror showed the image of a different man, one who had learned to value the simple things and fight for what truly mattered. Beside him, Matthew adjusted the tie with the precision of a mentor, preparing his apprentice for the most important challenge of his life. "You look like a man who has found his way, Daniel," Matthew said, with a smile that hid a slight shimmer of emotion in his eyes. "Today marks the beginning of something much bigger." Daniel nodded, his gaze reflecting gratitude and determination. "Thank you for being here, Matthew. I couldn't have done it without your words and your guidance," he replied, and in his voice was a sincerity he had rarely shown in his former life. Meanwhile, in the small music room converted into a dressing room, Caroline looked at herself in the mirror. Her dress was simple, made of white linen with handmade embroidered details by the women of the shelter, who had worked for weeks to make it special. The reflection of her face showed a glow that hadn't been seen in a long time. Hope. Anna, dressed in a small white dress and patent shoes, approached Caroline, holding a basket of petals. "Are you nervous, Caroline?" asked the girl, her eyes filled with the innocent curiosity only children have. Caroline smiled, taking Anna's small hand. "A little, but the good kind of nervous," she said, and in her words was a peace she had taken time to find. The ceremony began with the chords of a string quartet, composed of musicians who had worked with Caroline and had come to celebrate her special day. The guests, a mix of shelter residents, volunteers, and old friends who had met Daniel in his new stage of life, sat in chairs adorned with ribbons and flowers. The murmur of conversations turned into an expectant silence when Daniel stood at the front, waiting for Caroline with a smile that spoke of love, sacrifice, and a future full of promises. Caroline appeared, and the world seemed to stop. She walked with natural grace, her eyes met Daniel's, and for a moment, everything that had led them to that point passed before them like a flash. The bet, the awkward dinner, the painful words, the nights spent in silence, and the struggles at Johnson Holdings. The officiant, a friend of Matthew's and a former pastor, raised his hand and began the ceremony with simple words, resonating with the truth of what that moment meant. Today, we don't just celebrate a union, but a rebirth. Caroline and Daniel are an example that life, despite its trials, can always bloom, he said, his voice strong but warm. When the vows came, Daniel took Caroline's hands and looked at her with a contained emotion that only released in his words. "Caroline, some time ago, I couldn't have imagined being here or understanding what truly matters. With you, I've learned that love is not just words, but actions, sacrifices, and redemption. I promise to stand by you in every moment, not as a man who has all the answers, but as one who is willing to learn, to grow, and to love without reservations." Caroline's eyes filled with tears that she didn't hide. She had waited so long to believe in someone, to feel she could trust again. "Daniel, you taught me that even those who have walked dark paths can find the light. I promise to walk by your side, to share laughter, dreams, and the struggles life brings us. Together, we are stronger, and today, I begin to believe that we deserve this happiness." Applause and cheers filled the courtyard when the officiant declared them husband and wife. Daniel and Caroline kissed under the sunlight, surrounded by a community that had witnessed the birth of their story and celebrated their love as a shared triumph. The reception was a mix of music, food, and laughter. Anna, with her boundless energy, ran around the courtyard tossing flower petals, while the others looked at her with tenderness. Matthew, sitting in the front row, raised a glass and toasted with a voice choked by emotion. "For love that endures, for souls that find each other, and for the paths that, though difficult, are always worth it," he said, and the guests raised their glasses in response. As the evening turned into night, the lights of the garlands illuminated the courtyard, and the music filled the air. Caroline took her violin and played a melody she had composed especially for the occasion, a piece that blended notes of nostalgia with chords of hope and love. Daniel watched her with a heart full, knowing that this moment was the result of a long and arduous journey, but one that had been worth every step. In the following months, life continued its course. Daniel, true to his word, returned to Johnson Holdings, but on his own terms. He implemented changes that benefited the communities the company had long ignored, establishing sustainability projects and partnerships with social initiatives. His name, once synonymous with cold, calculated success, became a symbol of transformation and justice. Caroline, for her part, dedicated herself to teaching music to the children at the shelter and organizing charity concerts that brought the community together. Her passion for music and her ability to inspire others turned the art space into a vibrant and lively center. The day Caroline felt the first contractions, Daniel was by her side. The ride to the hospital was a mix of excitement and anxiety, but with every mile they covered, Caroline's hand intertwined with his gave him the peace and certainty that everything would be okay. The hospital, though modest, was filled with familiar faces. Anna, along with Matthew and other friends from the shelter, waited with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The little girl, always lively, practiced small dance moves to welcome the newest member of the family. The cry of their son echoed in the room, and Daniel, with tears in his eyes, held him for the first time. He looked at Caroline, exhausted but radiant, and in that moment, he understood that his life, though marked by mistakes and redemption, had found a deeper purpose than he had ever imagined. When Anna heard the good news, she ran down the hallway, tossing the last petals from her basket into the air, laughing with the overflowing joy of a child. It was a symbol that, although life was tough and paths uncertain, there was always room for hope and new beginnings. So, under the light of the stars and surrounded by those who represented goodness, struggle, and resilience, Daniel and Caroline knew they had arrived where they belonged, to a home built on love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable desire to be better together. And so we come to the end of this incredible story of redemption, love, and new beginnings. I hope you've enjoyed each chapter as much as I've enjoyed sharing it with you. If this story inspired you, made you reflect, or simply moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, there's always room for change and hope, even in the darkest moments. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you in the next story. Take care and keep seeking the light in every step of the way. See you soon.